Insane Karen tears out my heart monitor, insisting it's a toy for her kids. I'm in my late 20s now, but when I was 14, my life changed forever. I had my first heart attack while on vacation with my family, and I've been living with Brugada syndrome ever since. If you've never heard of it, it's a rare heart condition that can cause sudden heart irregularities and potentially lead to sudden cardiac arrest. For me, it started with the sharp sensation in my chest, and I remember collapsing on the hotel floor, barely able to breathe. Waking up days later in a hospital room, my life felt like it was falling out of control. The doctors told me that if I hadn't been at the hospital when the heart attack hit, I probably wouldn't have made it. They diagnosed me with Brugada syndrome, and from that moment on, everything changed. I couldn't do the things I loved without worrying about my heart. No more intense exercise or dangerous adventures. My doctor warned me that my future could look pretty grim, and to be honest, I wasn't sure how I'd manage, but somehow I pushed forward. The one piece of comfort I had was the heart rate monitor they gave me. It was a lifesaver. Whenever my heart rate starts getting out of control, the monitor beeps, and I can check in on it before anything gets too serious. Flash forward a decade. I'm used to the condition now as much as anyone can be. I have regular checkups at the local hospital where I go to ensure my heart is still ticking away. Sometimes I bring my girlfriend, sometimes my dad, but these days I mostly go alone. Recently, my girlfriend and I broke up, and I didn't feel like dragging anyone along to these appointments anymore. So on a Friday afternoon, I found myself walking into the hospital lobby by myself, as usual. The waiting room was its usual chaotic self, overcrowded, uncomfortable plastic chairs, and a general sense of unease in the air. Nurses were rushing around between the reception desk and the back room, dealing with an overwhelming number of patients. You could hear the movement of wheelchairs, the shuffling of paperwork, and the hushed conversations of anxious patients. But above it all, the loudest sound by far was the high-pitched screaming of two kids running around in the middle of the room. I noticed them immediately. A boy and a girl, siblings, I think, chasing each other in circles. They were laughing, but their laughter was sharp and obnoxious, almost like they were testing the limits of how much noise they could make. Worst part, no one seemed to care. Not a single adult intervened, even though their mischief were obviously disrupting everyone else in the room. It wasn't unusual to hear kids playing around in the waiting room, but this was a different level. The room seemed to collectively hold its breath as the chaos continued. I tried to ignore the noise as best I could, but it wasn't easy. After I checked in for my appointment, I found the nearest seat and settled in. I was already used to the long delays, and honestly, it was nice to have some time to just zone out. I hadn't brought my phone with me, which was a mistake, as I was already restless out of my mind. Instead, I started staring at the educational posters on the walls about healthy living and various medical conditions. Not the most entertaining stuff, but it passed the time. That's when the first event happened. I heard a sudden crash, followed by a loud yell, and then the distinct sound of pills scattering across the floor. I turned quickly and saw the two kids, Tommy and his sister, having run straight into a nurse. The nurse had been carrying a tray with medication, and now it was all over the floor. The little plastic pill bottles rolled everywhere, and a handful of multicolored pills spread out in every direction, like a ball pit filled with capsules instead of balls. It was like something out of a bad nightmare. The nurse scrambled to gather everything up, pushing past people trying to clean the mess as quickly as possible. Meanwhile, the kids just stood there, staring at the chaos they caused. They didn't seem to have the slightest clue about what had happened. Their expression was blank, almost like they didn't even realize they had done anything wrong. As the nurse continued cleaning up, a voice came from across the room. "Did you just bump my little darlings?" It was a woman's voice, sharp and condescending. She stood up from a chair, a phone in her hand, and walked toward the nurse with a slow, intentional stride. When the nurse didn't respond immediately, the woman stomped over, towering over her, clearly about to make a drama. The nurse didn't engage, and instead, she quietly continued to clean the mess, trying to push past the woman without getting caught up in a dispute, but it didn't work. The woman, whom I would later come to call Karen, because she was exactly that kind of entitled, rude parent, didn't stop there. She stood there, eyes flashing with annoyance, clearly upset that her children had caused a problem. After a few tense moments, Karen turned and walked back to her seat, mumbling under her breath. I couldn't help but feel annoyed. The kids had caused the problem, not the nurse. And yet here was this woman shifting the responsibility. I figured that would be the end of it. But of course, it wasn't. The kids, Tommy especially, kept running around completely ignoring the situation, and the noise just grew louder. I found myself growing increasingly frustrated. I didn't like hospitals, and I certainly didn't like being stuck in a room full of chaos and commotion. As much as I tried to ignore the whole situation, I couldn't help but notice the disturbance. I thought about intervening, maybe asking the kids to settle down, but I quickly realized that would probably just make things worse. I wasn't in the mood for arguments, especially with a woman who was already showing signs of being unreasonable. As I sat there trying to tune out the chaos around me, I kept hoping things would calm down, but as you can probably guess, they didn't. The kids didn't stop running, and they didn't stop yelling. Tommy, in particular, seemed to be taking pleasure in pushing everyone's limits. His voice was piercing, and he seemed to go out of his way to get close to people, bumping into chairs, knocking into tables, and generally making himself a bother. The girl, his sister, was no better, chasing him around like a little whirlwind. The entire waiting room felt like it was on the edge of a breakdown, and it was only a matter of time before someone snapped. I glanced around the room, hoping anyone, would step in and tell the kids to calm down, but no one did. Everyone was either too uncomfortable to speak up, or they were too scared to confront the entitled woman who was sitting just across the room, clearly oblivious to her children's conduct. It's funny how people just let things go when someone acts like they're entitled to get away with anything. I started to feel that frustration building up in my chest, the way it does when I'm already in a stressful situation. My heart rate monitor was sitting in my pocket, but I didn't want to take it out just yet. I tried to focus on the posters again, pretending like I was still reading, but it was getting harder. The noise was unbearable. After what felt like an eternity, Karen's name was finally called. She stood up, her high heels clicking sharply on the floor as she gathered her kids. I swear the whole room let out a collective sigh of relaxation. When she started walking toward the doctor's office, the tension in the room lightened immediately, and the waiting room seemed to breathe again. But of course, the peace didn't last long. As soon as Karen was gone, Tommy, who had been following her like a little shadow, immediately came back into the room without his mother hovering over him. He was free to cause more chaos. I noticed him looking around the room, his eyes scanning for something to do. That's when he saw me. He started to squirm in his chair across from me. I could feel his eyes on me, but I tried to ignore him, not wanting to deal with any more of his antics. But of course, ignoring him didn't work. He shifted in his seat, and after a moment, I felt a tap on my chest. My heart monitor. I looked up, and sure enough, Tommy was pointing at it, trying to figure out what it was. "What's this?" he asked, his voice shrill and loud. "Is this a toy or something?" "No, it's not a toy," I said, trying to stay calm. "It checks my heart rate." Tommy didn't seem to care. Instead of just letting it go, he frowned and continued to press at it, his fingers pressing into the monitor with more force. "It was beeping earlier," he said, raising his voice. "What's that all about? Is it broken?" I tried not to engage, but he wasn't letting up. The more I ignored him, the more he poked. I could feel the irritation creeping up my spine, but I just wanted to make it through this appointment without causing a problem. "Please stop," I said, my voice tight. "It's not a toy. It's important." But Tommy wasn't listening. Instead, his expression shifted to one of mild frustration. He frowned and tugged at the straps of the monitor, trying to pull it off my chest. I immediately shot up from my seat, fear rising in my chest. "Hey," I snapped, but it was too late. Tommy had already yanked the heart monitor free from my chest, and it was dangling from his little hands. My heart raced, and not in a good way. I could feel the panic starting to flood in, the pressure in my chest increasing again. The monitor had come off, and my heart was already acting up, racing with the stress and anxiety of the situation. I had to get it back. But before I could move, Tommy ran off toward his mom, who had just come back into the room. I felt my breath catch in my throat. This couldn't be happening, not now. Tommy's little feet were quick, and in a moment, he was standing beside his mother, holding my heart monitor out to her. I rushed over, trying to get it back, but as I neared her, Karen looked me up and down with that smug, uninterested expression on her face. She didn't even react when I came up to her. "What kind of adult are you, playing with toys in a hospital?" she mocked, not looking at me directly, but at the heart monitor. In her hand, I could feel the anxiety starting to rise. "I'm not playing with toys," I said, my voice shaking. "Now, that's my medical equipment. Please give it back." But Karen wasn't hearing any of it. She turned away and handed the monitor to Tommy, her son, who was now looking at it like it was some new shiny object to play with. My mind was racing. I could feel the tightness in my chest growing worse, the blood pulsing in my ears. My heart monitor was beeping now, the sound filling my head, only adding to the panic. "You can't just..." I started trying to reach for the monitor, but Karen quickly stood up and stepped in my way. Her expression was cold, calculating. She was enjoying this. "Calm down, kid. It's just a toy," she said dismissively, clearly not grasping the severity of the situation. "You're acting like a child over a stupid little device." My pulse was hammering in my chest, and I could feel myself starting to get dizzy. My vision blurred at the edges, and I knew that I was close to losing fully. I was trying to hold it together, but it felt like the world was slipping away. "Please," I whispered, but the words barely left my mouth. Before Karen's cold laugh cut through the air, she held the monitor out, mocking me with it as though it were some worthless trinket. The situation was spiraling, and all I could think was that if I didn't get that heart monitor back, things could get really risky really fast. The fear was escalating inside me. My heart was pounding so hard, I could hear it in my ears, drowning out the noise of the waiting room. I felt lightheaded, disoriented, and dizzy. The heart monitor, the thing that was supposed to keep me safe, was now in the hands of a child who had no idea what it was or how serious the situation could be for me. I reached for the heart monitor, but Karen blocked me again, her arm extended to keep me at a distance. The calmness in her manner contrasted sharply with the chaotic storm brewing inside me. I could feel the sweat starting to form on my forehead, my vision narrowing, and I knew I was on the verge of a panic attack. "Give it back," I demanded, my voice trembling now. I couldn't control it, couldn't keep the fear from spilling in over my chest. Ached, felt like someone was sitting on it, squeezing the life out of me. "That's not a toy. It's important. Please, I need it." But Karen just scoffed. Her eyes flicked to the monitor, then back to me. "You're not getting it back, sweetheart," she snapped. "It's just a little beep toy. You don't even need it. You're just exaggerating." She waved her hand dismissively, as if it was all nothing more than a bother. Her words stung, but they also made the anxiety worse. I felt like I couldn't breathe. This wasn't just some random object. This was my lifeline, my connection to making sure my heart didn't give out in a moment of stress. But to her, it was just some insignificant thing she could control. Just another way for her to flex her authority. "Please," I pleaded, my breath shallow. "Please, just give it back. You don't understand." But Karen wasn't listening. She looked at Tommy, who was still holding the monitor, and smiled like it was some little game they were playing. The sound of my heart monitor beeping like a loud song grew louder and louder, more urgent with each passing second. The more stressed I got, the more it beeped. And the more it beeped, the more my terror grew. I felt like I was suffocating. It wasn't just the physical pain of my heart acting up. It was the stress, the frustration, the helplessness of being stuck in the situation with no one willing to step in. I didn't know what would happen if my heart rate got too high, but I wasn't willing to find out. And then, just as I thought I might collapse, a nurse appeared in the doorway. She had a calm, no-nonsense attitude, the kind that immediately made me feel a little safer. She must have seen the look of panic on my face, because she didn't hesitate for a second. She marched straight toward Karen, who was still mocking me, and stood firmly in front of her. "Excuse Me? The nurse said, her voice firm but controlled. Give the monitor back now. Karen blinked in shock, not expecting the nurse's intervention. What? Why? This is just a toy. The kid's just being dramatic. No, it's not a toy, the nurse said firmly. That's a medical device. And if you don't return it immediately, I'm going to have to ask you to leave the hospital. She reached forward, trying to take the monitor from Tommy, who was still holding it out of reach, stepping back, arms crossed. I'm not giving it back. This is ridiculous. It's just a little beep thing. It's not even real. The nurse didn't give her a chance to finish. With one swift motion, she grabbed the heart monitor from Tommy's hands, snatching it away. Tommy yelped in surprise, but the nurse was quick to return it to me. I felt a wave of relief wash over me as she placed it back in my hands, the beeping slowing down as my pulse began to steady. Thank you, I whispered, still out of breath. I could feel the dizziness starting to ease, and the tightness in my chest slowly lessening. The nurse gave me a reassuring smile before turning back to Karen. Ma'am, you've caused enough trouble. If you continue to act like this, I will have no choice but to call security. Karen's face turned an ugly shade of red, her jaw clenched, and for a moment, I thought she might explode. But the nurse stood her ground unwavering as Karen huffed and muttered angrily under her breath. You have no idea who I am, Karen, snapped the volume of her voice, rising. I'm not some nobody. You can't just. The nurse raised a hand, cutting her off. I don't care who you are. You don't treat medical equipment like that, and you certainly don't harass patients who are trying to take care of their health. If you don't leave quietly, I will have you escorted out by security. I watched as Karen's eyes flicked around the room, no doubt realizing that the other patients were watching the scene unfold. Some of them were starting to mutter, shaking their heads in disapproval at her behavior. Karen opened her mouth to say something more, but before she could get another word out, security guards appeared at the door. The tension in the room was thick as the guards moved toward Karen, and the realization hit her. She wasn't getting away with this. She let out a final frustrated sigh and grabbed Tommy and his sibling by the hands, marching them out of the room in a rage. As they were escorted out, I could hear Karen grumbling curses under her breath. The room, once tense and charged with hostility, now felt almost calm in comparison. The beeping of my heart monitor was a gentle hum again, and I could finally breathe easier. My heart rate was slowing down and the fear was fading, though I could still feel the lingering effects of the stress as the door to the waiting room closed behind Karen and her kids. The room seemed to relax collectively. No one said anything, but it was clear we were all relieved it was over. I sank back into my chair, drained from the encounter. It was only then that I realized just how close I had come to a full-blown panic attack. My hands were shaking slightly, and I was still sweating, but I felt a strange sense of appreciation toward the nurse who had stepped in. The rest of the wait passed uneventfully, though my mind kept circling back to the situation. I couldn't believe how far it had escalated. Over a heart monitor, of all things. But at least it was over. At least I was safe. After Karen and her kids were escorted out, the tension in the room seemed to fade, but the unease lingered in the air. People were still quietly talking in hushed voices, likely recounting the incident they just witnessed. Some were trying to make light of the situation, whispering to each other in what seemed like attempts to ease the discomfort left by Karen's actions. But for me, the whole thing was still fresh, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I had just narrowly escaped a much worse situation. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, waiting for my name to be called. My heart monitor was back in place, but the beeping had stopped, and the worst of the anxiety had passed. I could still feel the tension in my chest, but it was nowhere near as bad as it had been a few minutes ago. My breathing slowly returned to normal, and I closed my eyes, allowing myself a moment to rest. But my mind kept returning to Karen and the way she had treated me, and the entire scene replayed in my head like a bad memory couldn't shake off. Eventually, heard my name called by a nurse at the front desk. I stood up slowly, trying to calm my nerves. As I walked toward her, I was still shaking, but I did my best to hide it. The last thing I wanted was to be seen as someone who couldn't handle a little conflict, especially in a hospital full of strangers. But I was relieved that the worst of it was over. As I followed the nurse down the hall to the exam room, I couldn't help but glance back over my shoulder toward the waiting area. The room was almost completely empty now, with only a few patients left scattered throughout. I briefly wondered if Karen would return to cause more problems, but a part of me hoped I'd never see her again. The staff had made it clear that her behavior was unacceptable, and I doubted they'd let her get away with it again. When I finally got into the exam room, I took a seat on the bed and the nurse took my readings. Before leaving to get the doctor, I looked around the sterile room, trying to distract myself from the stressful experience. The doctor eventually came in, and I tried my best to focus on the checkup, but my thoughts kept drifting back to the turmoil that had unfolded in the waiting room. The doctor reviewed my results, nodded approvingly, and gave me the usual advice about staying on top of my health. But I wasn't really listening. I was too tired physically and emotionally to focus on anything else. I just wanted to get out of there as quickly as possible and move on with my life. When the appointment finally ended, I walked out of the room feeling exhausted. The nurse who had intervened earlier was standing near the exit, and as I approached, she gave me a small smile. I couldn't help but feel thankful for her help. She had been a steady presence when I needed it most. "Thanks again for everything," I said, my voice a little hoarse from the stress. "I don't know what would have happened if you hadn't stepped in." She gave a small nod, her smile softening. "No problem. You looked like you were about to break there for a second." "Glad I could help." I smiled weakly, still a little on edge, but relieved nonetheless. "Yeah, I definitely wasn't handling it well." "Don't worry about it," she said reassuringly. "You were in a tough situation. You did what you could. Just try to take it easy from here on out. Stress can make your condition worse." I nodded, knowing she was right. Stress had always been my biggest enemy. It wasn't something I could avoid, but I could control it. Try to keep it from spiraling out of control like it had today. As I walked out of the hospital, I couldn't help but ponder on the day. It wasn't long after that day that I started seeing more of that nurse outside of the hospital. She reached out a few weeks later, asking if I wanted to grab coffee sometime. At first, I was hesitant, but over time, we started spending more time together. We talked about everything. Eventually, we began dating, and though it was unexpected, I couldn't have been happier. Looking back, I realized that everything had happened for a purpose. That nurse didn't just intervene that day. She became part of my life in a way I never could have anticipated. We'd both been through our own challenges, but we'd found a way to make it work. It was proof that even in the most hectic moments, sometimes the best things can come from the least expected places.